Okay, so hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk about APIs and AI and the role of AI with APIs, but not as a consumer. So we're not going to talk about AI APIs that I can consume, but I'm trying to dig more into where are we today and where are we going to be tomorrow in the world of AI for API developers for the API ecosystem. My last conference was at API Strategy in 2015. I was talking about microservices, and it was a whole different scene, a whole different thing back then. But I thought this would be more of a futuristic sort of presentation that we can picture ourselves today, and we can picture ourselves tomorrow. What are we going to do with AI, right? Because everybody's talking about AI. So we've come a long way since SOAP. If you think about it, it's been many, many years. And let's go to the next slide. So hope everyone's doing great. My name is Orlando Kalossakas. I moved here to Austin in 2015. During the day, I run a very small consultancy called Lightfast, basically LF.GG for short. I work with another person, and we build API automations and integrations for small businesses. I do a lot of things at night. I'm a meetup organizer for the Trello user group here in Austin, and that's sponsored by Atlassian. I'm a power user of Trello, which is a project management tool. I also help remotely organize the London Node.js user group, which is the largest meetup for Node.js developers in Europe. I also work in my spare time on open source libraries on GitHub, and I do other fun stuff. I have a bunch of side projects, and we can talk about it later during the break. So I like to begin with this slide. I think it's pretty obvious that right now, the way things are, APIs are built for humans. By humans, for humans. Machines are lagging way behind. They don't really understand APIs the way we do it. And to be like 100% transparent about it, as API developers and people who work in the API ecosystem put a lot of effort into making so that the APIs are being able to be consumed easily or like clearly by API developers. And that's why we spend so many resources and so much time building documentation, tutorials, articles. And if you think about it, we've come a long way because REST was, so to speak, invented in 2000 by Roy Fielding, and it's been pretty much 20 years. If you remember, eBay launched their first publicly available REST API back in 2002, and that was kind of like a huge step forward. SOAP was kind of complicated. People really didn't want to mess with that anymore, and that's why kind of REST became a thing. It's way more readable and easy to use by us humans. And as time has progressed, we also started building things to make REST more accessible to us developers and made it more so that it basically gets democratized, right? But APIs are still, coded by humans, explained to humans, developed and maintained by humans. So how is AI gonna change all that in the future? And that's kind of like the topic of today's session. If we look at how we've been working with APIs, most of you have probably been used curl and other command line interfaces tools similar as curl. In 2012, there's this great tool. If you haven't heard of it, it's called HTTPy. It makes it so much easier to call REST APIs and do basically HTTP requests. And as you probably have heard of, companies that are also today out there, like Postman, and there's a company called Stoplight. They're building this GUI REST clients that are kind of like a studio or like a really powerful IDE. And this is kind of a trend that is now being set, right? We're basically making these super powerful IDE editors that you can use to call APIs. You can use to write documentation to do contract testing for APIs. And there's a lot of other stuff that we do for APIs, such as like API gateways, all these other tools that are in the ecosystem. But again, these are all tools built by humans for humans, right? To make our life easier. But that's not what the future should hold. So if we look at how APIs are made today, there's usually some kind of business needs that surfaces. And then, a team gets together, they go on whiteboard some stuff. There's a lot of back and forth between teams, between people within the team of, API, security, designers, programmers, database people, obviously. And then, hopefully, most of you are now approaching the API building from as a design-first kind of like methodology, right? Where you go and you design your API using maybe a specification like the OpenAPI spec, and then you code it, you mock it, you test it, and then you deploy it, and using whichever infrastructure you prefer. And then there's a lot of developer experience activities, and that's where humans, right, again, are in the spotlight, right? They're right there. And they have to read all this documentation that people spend so many hours and put so much effort, and they come to conferences like this to talk about their APIs. They go and they talk about all these tools that they build to make APIs easily accessible. And then obviously once you've done all that and you start selling your API like Twilio or SendGrid or some other huge company, or maybe even selling it internally as inside your enterprise, then you have to maintain it, update it, and then maybe your API probably will evolve. But honestly, in the last recent years, everything has been done thanks to the OpenAPI. I mean, there's been a lot of moving forward thanks to people adopting OpenAPI specifications, and that's because of the OpenAPI initiative that was previously called Swagger, as you probably all know. And things, about 20 years ago, APIs were built specifically for an enterprise customer, and they were kind of private. They weren't very publicly available like they are today. We had XML, we had SOAP, REST wasn't really a thing, and then slowly REST started becoming a thing, and we used to spend a lot of time spending time on writing API. We didn't spend time writing API specification. We spent time scaffolding and testing and started creating all these tools where we kind of are today. Is kind of the opposite, right? Where we have all this huge ecosystem, and we put a lot of effort designing the API, but then a lot of the activities are generated and automatically programmed for us. So documentation can be derived from specification, servers and code to run API calls can be mocked quickly with one click. Documentation, again, is kept up to date, driven by OpenAPI specification. And even things like API testing and the onboarding of users, right, is now a way more prominent, let's say, task that we do, which we didn't used to do before. Security was kind of a joke back then, scalability so too. So OpenAPI, therefore, in my opinion, is definitely a winner. It helps us drive design, it helps us drive security, it helps us drive documentation, it helps us drive mocking and coding. When you start testing your API, you probably mock it and then you actually go and code it properly. And also it helps generate those low-level SDKs. Now, if you want to know more about how all these tools are out there and can help you, do all of these activities based on just an OpenAPI spec, basically an OpenAPI file, There's this URL that I invite everybody to take note of. It's openapi.tools. It's like a huge index of literally every other library. It's maintained by the community, and you can go up there. If you're working on some open source project or closed source project, you can add your tool in there, especially if you think it would be worth, for the ecosystem. And the reason, the OpenAPI has been dominating, it's basically the tools that have been built on it. If you remember, RAML, it's still being used by MuleSoft and API Blueprint, and then Swagger, which was the initial name for what now is called OpenAPI. They're kind of faded away. They're not as healthy as back then. So I think OpenAPI is definitely a clear winner. And it's built to be machine readable, and that's great because in the future, as we build more and more public and open APIs, the machines will have to start understanding these documents for doing a bunch of activities. And like other people will probably say later when they talk about documentation, it's your first stop for like developers to use as a source of documentation, and it's great. If some of you remember, back in 2013, there was this tool that got acquired by IBM called StrongLoop. That kind of set a little, path for where I think we're going. You basically had this kind of like command line interface where you would answer questions asked, like prompted to answer, and then at the end you would have like a nice little package of an API. And hopefully, as we progress through time, there's going to be more self-documenting APIs that are driven again by the OpenAPI spec that your developers should be writing prior to coding and prior to developing APIs. There's a lot of like efforts being put into API testing and security, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then the self-awareness that machines should be able to discover other APIs without us having to hard code it inside a certain client or a system or whatever else. So that brings us to AI and its role into the API ecosystem. There's not been much done into the world of AIs and APIs, and therefore when I started doing my research and talking with like PhD students and people that are trying to break into the world of AIs and APIs, they gave me some insight. AI is it's pretty young. It's like even in other like verticals which are not like API itself, maybe in like like medicine and like other kind of like stuff. AI is very at its infancy, and even more so into the API world, right? There's probably a lot of use of tools that are going to be built that will be using some parts of AI, and by AI I mean like maybe machine learning, but today not so many. The question is, how can AI help us build faster or better APIs, or like facilitate something in between? Well, I gave you like the context of how we've got from 20 years ago into REST, and then into using like all these tools, and then adopting OpenAPI specification to build more tools, and getting into that mindset of how we should build APIs. But the question is, can AI help us write better APIs by helping us coding it faster, more efficiently, with less errors, giving us the best practices? Can AI help us find patterns of intrusion and detecting anomalies when we deploy an API, or even when we code an API? And then ultimately, can we use AI to drive discovery and consumption of APIs so that we don't have to like hard code it ourselves into like whichever system we're building? We probably don't have enough OpenAPI specification documents out there to train a neural network to say, okay, here's like hundreds of thousands of OpenAPI specification docs. Go and learn how it looks and how you can automatically build an OpenAPI specification. Because if you just go on any website that promotes like the sharing of OpenAPI specification, there's probably like 1,500, right? Like that's not enough data to train any kind of neural network. And most of the APIs today, they're all enterprise, either they're private, people don't share the spec docs. So that's probably for far future. Now, as I said, we use OpenAPI specification to write SDKs, right? Like you can literally one-click export SDKs. Now, Daryl Miller that works at Microsoft once said in one of his presentation, code generation can make building code really easy, but it can also make it really easy to build poorly architected code. And that goes back to this concept where developers, they are easy and they can be lazy, and they can just press one button, and then you have a kind of like a CRUD, like client or SDK that wraps your API. But what you really need to do is to create an experience as a person who writes documentation, articles, blogs, and all that kind of stuff that helps developers really understand what are the best use cases for your API. And if you think about it, that's the same thing that a machine in the future will have to do. How will a machine understand what your API has been built to do. And it becomes unscalable, right? So do we hire more developers to maintain all the documentation? Do we hire more technical writers to write more tutorials and do like articles and like live streams to like teach people about APIs and your amazing product and your amazing service? Or not? Because we're still building more and more APIs. What are we going to do when we go from like 20 to 30,000 public APIs into like the 500,000, right? There's going to be basically, is everybody going to basically become an API worker in the API world? Well, probably no. So there's all these verticals into the API ecosystem that we can take a look at, and we can kind of like identify some of these where AI will be able to be helpful in the future. I think these ones are definitely the ones that are more interesting. So designing APIs helped by AI, implementing APIs, so like everything that has to do with coding, reporting and security, which I've seen a few companies already venture itself, and then everything that has to do with community experience and developer experience. I think there's a lot of space there for AIs to help. So from a design perspective, you could start feeding some kind of like machine learning algorithm with an AI, thousands of hours of that you've spent and collectively as an ecosystem that we spend designing APIs, feed all this documentation, and then hopefully the machine will learn to understand it and to build its own based on like a command, like, hey Alexa, can you build this API? But it's probably unlikely because, like I said before, we don't have enough OpenAPI specifications out there, so it's not for now. But AIs will also be able to perform more human-like tasks that are really used during the API design process. And there's a lot of other things that we can do, such as solving the discovery of APIs through using AIs, and then parsing like all this data inside the OpenAPI specification to like find out extra use cases and helping with writing code. And the important thing is that AIs right now, they don't really understand much, right? Like that's literally like, we're at this super low level where AIs are very, very, very like kind of like worms, right? Like we have to put so much more effort into creating mentors, where AI is going to become a mentor for us developers, for us API people. And one of the most important thing is that the meaning of the data that we expose with our APIs needs to be not only like derived from like a response or a documentation, but the machine needs to learn it. And as we scale and build more and more APIs, that's going to become more and more of an important thing. Hypermedia is probably the first step that we've taken, right? So if you guys are familiar with Hydra, JSON LD, or Supermodel, these are all like things that I suggest you take a note and go and read because they're the first step that we've been taking in the past to like do this whole hypermedia thing. What we need is basically a shared vocabulary where like both humans and machine will understand so that we can start, dropping out some of the work we're doing today as developers to the machines. And that was kind of one of the points that James, before doing the keynote, was saying how we're trying to go back to, a more simplistic world as API developers, right? And people have been using Zapier and all these other tools, and it's all like nicely packaged in the back, and you don't see any of that. So maybe that's the future of where AI is going to help us make more of that and less of what we're doing today. Now, how can AI power software engineering? So by software engineering, I mean the part where you code APIs. Well, there's been like 3 major companies that I've researched into. Rice University released this AI-powered deep learning algorithm that takes some Java code and it trains the neural network to basically look at your Java code and say, hey, this is wrong. Hey, you could do this better. Hey, this is something that's not really how it's usually done, and all these best practices. It's still very early stage. Another company that's doing kind of this is Kite.com. If you're a Python developer, I suggest you go and check it out. It installs as a plugin for your whatever IDE you guys use, and then it basically gives you a lot of like hints and like inline, kind of like a mentor, like somebody kind of pair programming with you. It would be like sitting next to you. It kind of like tries to like, make that human, pair programming thing into like you and an AI. And then finally, there's a local company here in Austin, Texas called Pull Requests. And what they do is basically, right now they're just a marketplace that allows you guys to go in and say, hey, I don't know if the people in my team are writing proper code, so it allows you to hire developers out there and basically review code on your behalf. So kind of like your, Mechanical Turks for code reviews, but they're building all this information and they have all these best practices and all this data that I foresee them in the future being able to take all this knowledge that they have and build some kind of system that will automatically say, hey, you're building code wrong, this is how you should do it. In the same spirit as Kite.com and this Bayou system. So are we far from Alexa build as an API, please? Yes, that is definitely something that it's not for today. We're very far away, we have a lot of work to do, and it would be great if we all had mentors that would just like sit next to us and be like, hey, I'm not a human, I'm a machine, and I'm gonna help you. So another thing, and I'm gonna finish on this slide, APIs, and there's a lot of the developer experience work and a lot of community experience work. And one last thing that I think AI will be able to do is help us doing this task with chatbots, right? Everybody knows, oh, chatbots. I hate chatbots. They're not really human. They don't really understand. But there's another local company called ClaimBot that they rolled out one of their chatbots to a local company, I think it's Silvercar, and in just 6 months, they handle 15% of all their interaction with people that have claims. And basically, it cut the call center cost by 20%, which for them is hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if we can do that for like insurance claims, why can we not do that for onboarding developers? And that's pretty much it. That's a quote from Mehdi from API Days, a friend of mine. He said that basically we have so many more things that we have to worry about today in the API world that probably AI isn't really the cool thing that we should be looking at. We should probably try invest more time into, so to speak, getting more people to use OpenAPI API specs and all that kind of stuff. But I think in the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be more talks about API, and hopefully, this is just like the first talk, and there's going to be more people talking about APIs and AIs in the future. And that's pretty much all I have. Special thanks, and that's a wrap. Thank you.